Hi, folks. It's me, Joe Pasevich, in a goofy mood on Wednesday. Excuse me. What is today? The 5th? Wednesday, February 5th, 2025. It's 2525 today. If you're writing a check, 2525, and I'll tell you how to spell my name later. Thank you very much. It's a chilly day here in Marshfield. I hope it's nicer wherever you are. There's snow in the forecast for tomorrow, Thursday. It's going to be coming in. It's like 19 degrees when I came over to the studio just now. It's going to get really cold into the low teens tonight, and then tomorrow we got a wintry mix coming in. Snow, sleet, freezing rain. It's going to be kind of a cold, slushy day. Turning to all rain, followed by another storm, I believe Saturday night. They're saying Saturday night now, another storm. Again, starting out snow and sleet, a mixture, turning to rain. Then next, I believe Tuesday or Wednesday, a third storm. So boom, 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 we're in an active pattern. And the one on Tuesday, Wednesday is projected to be a little more productive in the snow category. So that's what we have to look forward to. Tonight I have the privilege to bring to you a couple of discussions that I had earlier today with Diana Viens from Winthrop and attorney Mike Walsh, and also a short talk with the writer Christine Hill. She's an international journalist from Duxbury, now living in Duxbury, and she's been writing quite extensively on local issues, including on the MBTA Communities Act. Diana Viens is the party, I call it the party, the plaintiff, that filed a complaint in Suffolk Superior Court last Saturday. And the complaint, which is like 86 paragraphs on 12 pages, that's the single space version of the complaint. Now, when you file a complaint in court, you have to, I think it's double space it. Okay, so this 12-page, 86-paragraph complaint with 36 page or 38 pages of attachments, something like that, was filed on her behalf by attorney Mike Walsh last Saturday. And basically it seeks to block the implementation of the promulgation of the emergency regulations of the MBTA Communities Act. As you know, the MBTA Communities Act was something that we in Marshfield voted on twice. We were told we had to vote to adopt them, and if we didn't vote in the affirmative to adopt these regulations or guidelines, as they were trying to call them, then we would be in violation of Chapter 40A, Section 3A, which is commonly known as the MBTA Communities Zoning Act, okay? It's an amazing dictate, unprecedented as far as I know. There's nothing in Chapter 48 which deals with establishing zoning regulations that comes anywhere near this MBTA Communities Act. This actually mandates the creation of a zoning area where under Section 5 of Chapter 48, it says that any zoning changes are controlled by the locality, by the voters in the locality, whatever town or city you're in, okay? So this is something new. They're trying to break some new ground. The way they're doing it and the way the law and the regulations are written is not doing much to quell the suspicions of conspiracy theorists out there, okay? Obviously there are short and long-term political goals here, and probably I believe long-term social engineering type goals, 15-minute cities along that line. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the brief talk that I had with attorney Walsh and Diana Viens, and you'll dig it. This is good stuff. Pay attention. Okay, good evening. Here on Control Room, we're really privileged and very excited to have with us right now Diana Viens and Mike Walsh, Diana Viens is from Winthrop, Massachusetts, on the North Shore. Mike Walsh is an attorney practicing land and criminal law based out of Linfield, Massachusetts. Welcome, guys.
Hello.
We're here to talk about a complaint that was filed back on February 1st, a ray of hope for the people all around Eastern Massachusetts and beyond that are being confronted with the MBTA Communities Act, or I call it MBTA zoning. And this is impacting or being focused upon, I think it's a canard actually, upon 177 communities that they call MBTA communities. Now, what the definition of that is and why is a place like Marshfield an MBTA community, it's a subject of quite a debate. But I want to start out with this complaint being filed, like I said, on February 1st. It's a lengthy complaint. I mean, the first 12 pages is the actual body of the narrative of the complaint, and then it's backed up by another 30-plus pages of supporting documentation. This is 12 pages, 5 counts. How many different paragraphs? 86 paragraphs, basically, technically, and it is a lot of work. You cannot mess around when you're challenging something like the MBTA Communities Act, Chapter 48, Section 3A. First, I want to talk to Diana. Diana, thank you for being here. You've given hundreds of thousands of people some kind of a ray of hope, something to root for as we get on this long journey. And this is going to be a bit of a long journey, I think. I don't think we're going to get rid of the MBTA Communities Act like that. It's going to take a lot. It's going to be a long slog. So tell us about yourself, Diana, and what made you push for this complaint to be filed?
Well, there's no emergency to speak of, and
Right.
Thank you for the introduction, Joe. It's very nice, and Christine. So
Well, I want to hear more about you, Diana. People are wondering, who's Diana?
I'm just a full-time working mother, wife, community member. I like trees. I have 2 cats. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think I think what I would say about me is that I am not just me. There are people in our town and in your town and in 177 towns and cities that are saying the same thing, and it's just a matter of continuing to send the message and making sure that everyone feels like they have a voice, and everyone does indeed have a voice, and just bringing up the issues that you see. And that's really it, and that's what everyone is doing. So I applaud everyone who's contributing to this effort. It's massive. To your point, you don't mess around when you're dealing with the MBTA Communities Act, which is toothless. It's almost wholly propaganda driven and not based on any real substantive problem that has been articulated. What is the problem we're trying to solve? No one knows at this point. All we know is that we are being pegged for the solution of some sort, in some way, somehow. And now it's an emergency.
And with all the talks about basically social type engineering, 15-minute cities, I mean, they're not doing much to dispel conspiracy theories, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And who's actually behind the MBTA Communities Act? I fought 40B years ago. Who was actually behind 40B? Well, we know. And usually it comes down to following the money.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot to unfold here, but it's also hard to get distracted by some of those things. And I think by filing this really well thought out, intricate complaint, you've really been able to pull together all the issues for the people to understand what's going on even better. So this is a great service, not just in stopping something that's wrong-headed and harmful, but to really help educate people and help people think in a very rational and legalistic way about what's really going on.
Yeah.
So with that, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I just want to say thank you for saying that, Joe, because I think that a lot First of all, Kevin Martin is brilliant, and what he did in Milton was brilliant. He was slightly hamstrapped, if that's the right word, by the rules of engagement and what made sense given the 30 minutes or 15 minutes he had in front of the SJC after a year's worth of work in terms of what he could raise and what he could focus on. Over a year has gone into 177 towns and cities. And Christine is one of these people that has really exposed a lot of the underpinnings of what's happening here. Has gone into exposing a lot of this stuff. This, in addition to being absolutely necessary, there's no emergency here, and it's a disservice to the entire citizenry of our state not to raise the fact that you can't just claim emergency to get around, an SJC ruling. But in addition to the fact this is now an opportunity to shed light on all of those massive, really infractions of the EOHLC that have bubbled up to the surface over a year through just exorbitant amounts of research done by millions of people.
I deal with the EOHLC. I'm a housing commissioner here in Marshfield, by the way. And it's not easy dealing with the EOHLC. I think Mike knows a little bit about housing authorities too. And I can tell you one thing, when I go to the EOHLC with questions about what we're doing, I get basically no service. I'm beginning to think they're all tied up working on this instead of worried about local housing authorities. But to your point about getting the word out and educating people, we're all doing our part. Christine has already written at least 2 fantastic articles. And there's a Greg and Brian out at Shrewsbury through their cable show have been doing a great job educating people, getting the word out. And, we're doing our part down here. So with all that, I want to go back to Mike Walsh. Mike, this complaint, again, 12 pages, 80-something paragraphs, 5 counts, okay? Now tell us what a count is, and it's titled, A Complaint for Declaratory Relief, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Suffolk Superior Court, and this was filed again back on February 1st. So tell us, what are the 5 counts, and what are you hoping to accomplish with this complaint?
So a count is basically a specific legal theory that falls under a common fact pattern, which is why you can plead several different counts under a complaint. The story of this complaint, as Attorney Viens has indicated to you earlier, is the immediate fallout following the Milton decision. They promulgated new emergency regulations. You may remember the governor vowed to have them in place by the end of the week as soon as the decision was released. It took her a couple extra days for her crew to all get everything signed off. And this complaint followed. Attorney Viens actually wrote a lot of the substance of the complaints about the lack of an emergency. Count 1 essentially argues that the emergency regulation is an improper circumvention. It's a deliberate workaround the notice and public comment. And for those who are arguing that there's going to be no standing, this is one of the places where Attorney Viens is going to do pretty well because she's been active in this area, as is her committee in Winthrop, and they have a lot to say about the MBTA zoning, and so circumventing their right to comment, this is what's going to give her standing to have real teeth in a lawsuit.
And I noticed that was the foundation for that was laid out really well in the preamble. It gave good background on Diana's activism and involvement.
I hope so. The short answer is that normally there's a lot of deference paid to emergency regulation, emergency findings, but you have to still check the necessary boxes, as the EOHLC learned in the Milton case. It requires strict compliance. And the other thing is that they're not supposed to prejudge the case. And because they say, oh, we're going to put in the exact same emergency regs as we had guidelines, and we're going to make them permanent as soon as we can, we think we've got a pretty good prejudgment case here. The second count is actually a very technical count, which is that in order to have an emergency regulation, an agency has to make 2 very specific findings. First, it has to say, hey, there's an emergency. The second finding it has to make is that the delay caused by a public hearing or by public comment would delay the emergency and hurt the welfare of the citizenry. So it has to find that public comment or hearing isn't conducive to governing, and EOHLC did not have any language about that at all in their emergency filing.
Now,
So
do you think the UHLC has got the expertise or the background in determining an emergency, making a ruling on emergency on something like this, which Because I don't think there's anything like this that's ever been forced into a zoning regulation or zoning law.
No, this is a new foray for the state. This is really the first time the state, I mean, even 40B, it's like parcel by parcel. This is the first time the state's ever really come in and said, zone how we want you to zone, at least since the Home Rule Amendment went into effect.
And of course, it's not an emergency because they themselves say that changing zoning doesn't result in any immediate changes.
Right. The rallying cry on the yes side is that it's zoning, not building.
Right.
That was actually, and that's a primary portion of count 3, which is a little bit lengthier, and it basically says there's no urgency to justify no urgent factual basis to justify the regulation. It points out that EOHLC has, dragged its feet out through the Milton case. It points out that they don't really seem to be interested in complying, except when they absolutely have to, when they get called on the carpet on it. It points out that several of their actions are politically timed, which kind of suggests that this is more of a political emergency than a real true emergency, a threat to the health and welfare of the public. We also point out in here that it's got that the regulation, the emergency, for all that the governor is arguing that this is a housing for fire and policemen, that 3A affordable housing, even under this, is not affordable for teachers or anybody. Beyond that, count 4 is we argue that the factual basis of the regulation is insufficient. And this is kind of an argument where we're trying, sometimes, not always, you can get into the actual merits of a regulation. And in this particular case, you have to convince a court that the government has acted irrationally, or the technical term is arbitrary and capricious if it goes up on review. And so kind of borrowing from the emergency findings in count 4, we're arguing that that there's no real basis for the regulation. And then in count 5, we're arguing that this is the regulations are procedurally improper. You may remember in Section 3A, the actual statute, it says that EOHLC is supposed to issue their guidelines in conjunction with the Mass DOT, the MBTA, and the Executive Office of Economic Development. Out of pure curiosity, we went to MassDOT and asked them for copies of any approvals that they gave for these emergency regulations. Mm-hmm. We also asked them for approvals about the guidelines, and they came back and said, we have no documents whatsoever, which indicates that no one asked them to sign off on this. Okay. So if MassDOT didn't sign off on this, then A, it isn't really transit-oriented housing, and B, it's contrary to the legislature's specific requirement that they consult with the transportation authorities.
Did they actually consult with the MBTA, or as I'm contending, they're just using the MBTA as a canard?
I suspect they're using the MBTA as a canard. The regulations as well as the guidelines both say that they were issued in consultation with the MBTA, but who knows what the actual paperwork is behind the thing. The Latin term that. Sorry,
I also hear now that there's somebody who's raising the issue that the FAA was also not consulted.
I think that's Mr. Stearns, and yes, he's a smart guy, particularly considering the strong preemption provisions that are in the FAA. I haven't dissected his article, but he is a very sharp guy.
And also, is this where the consideration about economic planning comes into play? The lack of economic planning or the creation of some sort of impact statement?
Yes, that's certainly a piece of it, but the legislature also deliberately said, consult the Economic Development Office before you put these requirements into effect. Yeah. And right now, this is still very much EOHLC's kind of cookie-cutter formula where every one of the 177 goes into the shuffle and they get their hundreds of units assigned to them.
And I just blows my mind that the amount of costs that are going to be incurred on a local level for all the digging and all the consultation and impact studies. How do they expect cities and towns and the citizens ultimately to pay for all this? But I'm sorry to interrupt on that.
No worries. The answer right now is that they've given out $25 million in what are called technical assistance grants, where if you're a town and you want to comply, you're welcome to apply to them for money to then build the big zone. I don't know that $25 million is enough to get all 177 towns through their planning and zoning and all the infrastructure designs over the next decades that they're going to need to support the housing that's going to follow this. back to the complaint,
Yep.
the last count is actually an open challenge to the regulations themselves. This essentially you may remember from the Milton case that the SJC very specifically said because of a procedural deficiency in how they were adopted, we say nothing about any of the merits to any of the arguments that the regulations exceed the statute or they're contrary to other provisions. So here we put some specific arguments in that the regulations actually
Right.
exceed the statute. EOHLC has run out ahead of its mandate. One of them, of course, is requiring density above the statutory requirement. We did a spreadsheet map of all of the 177 communities, and in more than half of the cases, they're trying to require density above the statutory mandate. The statute says you only need 15 units per acre, and starting right there at Rowley at 15.75 units per acre, going up to Cambridge at like 419 units per acre, that's an attempt to force towns to go bigger than the legislature said that they had to. And so there's an argument there that the EOHLC is kind of acting without authority.
Wow, so from point A, the statute, to EOHLC promulgation of so-called guidelines, up to 400 units per acre?
In Cambridge, yep, that's the density.
Wow. Could you tell us what's the difference between a guideline and a regulation?
So the Attorney General actually tried to argue this in Milton. They tried to argue that guidelines aren't binding, sort of, kind of, and so therefore they're not subject to Chapter 30A. And the SJC said that it doesn't really matter what you call them. The question is, are they binding rules or not? And that determines whether they're subject to the Administrative Procedures Act.
Wow. But they did find that they are subject to it.
Yes, indeed
And
they
that
are.
would be true with guidelines or regulations?
Well, as a housing commissioner, you know that Fairhaven case with the Fairhaven Housing Authority's executive director's contract is what they use to argue about guidelines. But generally speaking, guidelines, as mentioned in 30A's definition section, are internal to the government. They don't affect private rights. They don't affect private parties. They're how one government agency tells itself or its employees how it's going to do. And this really does affect people's lives, their zoning, their rights. And so this is a much broader impact, and that's why they went with this as a regulation. One of the other arguments we put up to effect is that EOHLC has exempted the city of Boston from the mandate of the MBTA Zoning Committee. And this is kind of contrary to statute. 40A says MBTA communities are defined as the same ones in Chapter 161A, which is the MBTA zoning law, and Boston, of course, has the T better than anybody. The reason they've exempted them is because EOHLC is of the opinion that Boston is exempt from 40A, which it normally is because it has its own zoning code, but it's not completely exempt. So that's one of our arguments. One of the other arguments, and this is one that Attorney Viens has been championing far and wide, is the argument that EOHLC's rules in the emergency regulations about no minimum bedroom size and no minimum number of bedrooms is directly contrary to the provisions of the state sanitary code.
Yes, yes.
And then in the guidelines,
what about fire codes?
The Chapter 3A, the MBTA zoning law, says that they have to subject themselves to the sanitary code and the environmental law. It does not say anything about for or against them subjecting themselves to the fire code, the electrical code, the plumbing code, or any portions of the building code.
Yeah,
Okay.
and on that,
Go ahead,
Joe,
Diana.
I'll say that the density argument is huge. In Winthrop, we are a neighbor of East Boston. Of course, East Boston is exempt, right? East Boston has 5 train stations. Winthrop has no train stations. East Boston is less dense than Winthrop. Winthrop is tied to the MBTA because of a train station in East Boston, Orient Heights, believe it or not. But that's very selective enforcement, and it also shows that the EOHLC does in fact have the ability, authority, power to exempt certain towns and give certain towns a break, even when they are named in the statute as a MBTA community, which Boston is. I'll also say that what happened here, and Mike pointed this out too, is immediately after that ruling, the governor, and along with the EOHLC, announced that they would be doing an end run around the ruling of the Massachusetts Supreme Court immediately. If if agencies, which are not elected, they are appointed, which is why Chevron at the federal level just got overturned after 30 years. If agencies are allowed to simply raise their hand and say, we don't have to follow this Supreme Court ruling, all we have to do is say this is an emergency when there is no emergency, in order to get around the highest court of the land rulings, what we have as a result of that is a unelected body that is now allowed to go into any town at any point and mandate any type of zoning they want from now on into the future. This is ultimate authority.
Well, you've just said a couple of things I
from
wanted
here
to
on
touch
out.
on with you.
So that is
First of
why
all,
this
what is
case
an
so
MBTA
important.
community?
It's-
Some of
it
us are
has
making the
massive
argument
implications for
that
future of
the
our
original
town.
Chapter
We are no
161, I
longer,
believe, designation of an
able
MBTA
to
district
say, hey, this
contains so many
apartment building
communities,
across
but
the
then
street from
others
our
got
home
added.
in a neighborhood that's got no
Is there,
parking.
is there an effort now to actually
and,
challenge what is an
down the street
MBTA
from an
community? Because in
overcrowded
Marshall, we
school
have no
doesn't
MBTA
really
service.
work here. We don't have the ability.
The adjacent town, Situate, has a commuter rail, but that's miles and miles away.
There are a number of folks who are making a political argument in bills that have been presented to the legislature. But in terms of a legal argument, it's a little hard because there was this case for one of the small towns in southern Worcester County. I think it was Princeton, might have been Maynard. Back in the 1970s, that was forcefully, against their will, added to the MBTA. And they cried out and they said, we don't have a train station. We're not even next to a town that has a train station. Why are we shelling out to pay for the MBTA? And the SJC said that, at least absent any other considerations, that there was no reason to believe that the legislature couldn't simply add you in. There were a number of towns, including there were a huge number of towns when the MBTA was failing in 2000, that were added in a late night deal under, I think it was then Tom Finneran, to try and have the wealthy suburbs who must be using the commuter rail pay involuntarily out of their cherry sheet money.
Fundraising.
And the best part is, of course, because it's on the cherry sheet, it's money that they would give to the towns in local aid, but then they take back, so you never actually see the money that will be going to you. So it's the greatest way of taking money out of the pockets of the suburbs.
That's why they say organized crime doesn't like the government, because and vice versa.
Competition.
Competition, right. Now, the other thing you touched upon, Diana, too, you mentioned the politics of this and how there seems to be a drive to be able to take over zoning it. And to me, like in count one, you mentioned that there was a short-term political reason for filing these emergency regulations, or to file the promulgation of these regulations in an emergency sense. But isn't there a long-term objective here? Isn't the long-term objective, again, we're gonna feed the conspiracy theorists, isn't the long-term objective the 15-minute cities and more centralized control?
I would say
Did you get that sense?
There is a long-term objective, and that is to have state control over the land in these towns and have the ability to dictate what happens at the local level, which is local zoning and local decision making is ingrained in our culture since the inception of this country. This entire law goes against our very core. And the foundation of our cities and our charters and everything that we are founded upon. And that is why there's something inside the general majority that this doesn't sit right with. To your point, Joe, this is absolutely a politically motivated thing in a lot of these plans that are going forward. Arguably, according to the EOHLC and the governor and the attorney general, nothing will get built. Paper compliance. Why on earth would they accept these things if they're paper compliance? This is about the land underneath. Another thing we've seen in this political marketing campaign is this idea that these things are affordable. Of course they're not affordable. We now have a glut in the market of luxury apartments because of legislation like this. It is in the law that you cannot have affordable units in these apartments. It says you have to be even if the town chooses to require the allowable up to 10% of affordable units in one of these 3A apartment buildings, those are only for people making 80% of the area median income or above, not for people like that are school teachers, that are firefighters, that are, you know, making a living wage. That's a huge problem in this country, which is a topic for a different day. And at the end of the day,
It is, and believe me, there are some firefighters and police
oh
officers
yeah,
that are not
I'll say
actually
starting salary,
poverty-stricken.
and then
that's-
I guess
I don't want to get into.
And then I guess I'll just finish
I
off by
know, I
saying
know.
things have changed since this law was enacted. MBTA ridership is now at 50% of what it was post-COVID era, and it's not coming back as evidenced.
Yes,
by
I know
the
about
vacancies.
that. Mike, I want to ask Mike a question in the last minute or so we have.
Fire away.
By forcing this emergency implementation, didn't they actually create a new condition as part of the guidelines? Because now they're saying that we have to submit a letter to the ELHLC promising to have another vote.
Yes, very much so. It's creating more paperwork and more job security if you're a bureaucrat at EOHLC.
Wow. Look, there's so much more we could go into, and the idea that this is an emergency because there are what they have basically said, and what Brian and Greg said on their show up in Shrewsbury is true, I think, that they created an emergency by saying that because towns have already adopted this, it would be unfair to them if
They
other
would like
towns weren't
nothing
now
more than
forced
this
to
to
adopt
be
it.
taken off of their
just
plate.
wanna-
But at the end of the day, this isn't a wildfire, you know, taking down half the houses in the state. This isn't a pandemic. This is not an emergency. This is a political emergency.
Right. In the meantime, we urge everybody to put in comments. There is an open comment period going on right now for these regulations, so everybody's got to pile on and get in there and comment. And again, this complaint, Mike, is going to be served when?
It's being served today, and the answer from the state will be due within 21 days.
Answer from the state in 21 days. So we'll be looking forward to that. Mike, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Diana, thank you. This has been great. I'm sorry we only have this amount of time, but we all have to do our part to get the word out
Indeed.
there and publicize
Nice
this
seeing
as
you,
much as
Christine.
possible.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very
Indeed.
much.
Thank you much.
We'll talk to you again soon.
Cheers.
That was a great conversation. It was kind of rushed, and we did it just a short time ago, so we had to get the video packaged up and downloaded just to get it on the air at this time. And so I apologize to Diana for us stepping on each other at one point there. But she was making a really great point during that talkover, just before that talkover period again, which is, I'm sorry, unavoidable. We should have had our headphones on, I guess, to monitor who was saying what. She was making a great point about there being long-term objectives behind this emergency promulgation and behind the whole idea of MBTA zoning to begin with. And also that how important it is to make a stand against the promulgation of regulations in this emergency way. This is what's important about this. In other words, we're not going to kill MBTA zoning in 3A through this lawsuit. I think that's going to be a long-term battle. We're going to have to slug it out for a while. But the importance behind challenging the promulgation of these regulations as an emergency is very critical, because as Diana was pointing out, you know, some agency could then say, well, the Supreme Court decision regarding Chevron doesn't apply because this is an emergency. And if you have a chance, if you're computer literate and you can find this complaint and read about why it is not an emergency, that's crucial. A lot of great thought went into this, and this is more than just a primer, okay? Not only on dealing with overbearing government intrusion and regulation, but on the issue itself. And the idea that it's an emergency, again, there are many great points being made about that in this complaint. And one of them that I mentioned during that interview with Diana and Mike, was that essentially the EOHLC, which under the section of Massachusetts law that deals with how do you promulgate an emergency regulations, the EOHLC was saying, well, it's an emergency basically because other towns have already adopted it, like Norwell and many other towns that were frightened into adopting these guidelines. Well, because they've already adopted it, it's not fair to them that other people haven't adopted it. It's like saying, because some bunch of people all jumped off a cliff, it's not fair to them that you're not. Okay, so this is what's, and I've actually seen an interview recently done with some of the people that are behind this, that are actually like the authors, the real proponents and pushers of this, that probably get paid from the Federal Reserve Bank or some unknown source, to do these kinds of things. And again, they're not doing anything to quell the conspiracy theorists out there, okay? So anyway, another great point, as Attorney Walsh mentioned under count 5 of the lawsuit, there's a lack of, there's a Latin term they use when you don't deal with the real regulations and you don't talk to the other people that are responsible for promulgating these rules. Let's see. I'm going to give you a little bit of a lesson in Latin. Where is it? Let's count 4. Let's see. Ultra vires. ULTRAVIRES. Okay? It's outside their authority to adopt these regulations. And, as Attorney Mike Walsh was saying, they didn't consult with this is a transportation rooted or oriented act of legislation, but there were no sign-offs from the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. Where were the other agencies that were supposed to be chiming in on environmental, economic impacts? And as I mentioned, there's even some people that are raising the issue that the Federal Aviation Administration was not consulted about potential impacts. In other words, could you be putting high-density housing in areas under intensive air traffic? And I know in Milton that's been a long-term issue because a lot of, I would say the majority of air traffic going into Logan slides right over Milton, Randolph, Milton, right up that corridor there. Now, we were also really fortunate. Again, this is going to be a long battle, and we're going to need your support, and we're going to need people to make comments and be involved in this, okay? I'm going to make another point about that in a minute. We're also very, very unfortunate to have Christine Hill available to us today, and I had this brief conversation with her in terms of MBTA zoning and Duxbury. So we're back again, and this time we're with Christine Hill. Christine Hill is a Duxbury resident, originally from Duxbury. She's got ties to the long ties to the community. She's a journalist, Harvard-educated journalist who has worked internationally, and her articles these days are found on duxbury.substack.com. Christine, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you again. You've been following the MBTA Communities Act and other things very closely.
I have
and
been.
You've written 2 articles.
I have. I think the most interesting one in terms of Duxbury is compliance for the sake of compliance. Because the last time we tried to do the MBTA zoning, some people who are real housing advocates came in and excuse me, can we stop recording for just a second?
No problem.
So that didn't work out. Okay, so compliance for the sake of compliance. The last time we tried to do MBTA communities, some really left-wing housing activists took over the zoning plan.
Was this part of the crew that we just talked to Diana and Mike about, that were going around town to town advocating for the MBTA communities?
No, it was a local group of people. Like there was one guy who worked for this left-wing NGO. There was one guy who works for a Healy administration linked company. There's another guy who really is into doing what the rules say for some reason. And so they tried to put this giant development in this residential area that was a lot of people felt was gonna ruin their houses and also ruin the hydrology around their houses so their basements would flood.
So there is actually like a working group set up in Duxbury to come up with some sort of response to this.
Yes, it was the MBTA Communities Working Group.
And so it sounds like it may have been infiltrated or influenced by those forces.
Yes, so the planning board and the select board were like, do the minimum you need to do
Right.
to comply. Find all the areas. Go on.
Well, that was great about your article. You gave a really a peek into what was happening and what the original version was that came out. And there was apparently a conflict. There were people who wanted to just comply minimally with the MBTA Communities Act. Like as in Norwell, they put their MBTA zone in a place where they admitted, as in Marshfield they said they were doing, they were putting the zone, designating the zone in a place where they claimed it would probably never happen.
Right.
And then there are people that say, no, we really should comply with the spirit and the intent of the of Section 3A of 40A.
That's exactly what happened. And so what every people on the select board and planning board, for the most part, wanted them to do was to find places that had already been developed.
Yeah.
Zone that put one overlay for 25 acres in this place called Island Creek, and then go around and put little zoning overlays in the rest of town in areas that had already been developed or were unlikely to be developed, so there wouldn't be major changes to the communities. But then there were the people on the committee wanted to really change the way zoning worked in Duxbury. And
so when it went to Duxbury Town Meeting, there was already a preliminary, I forget the term they used, plan submitted to EOHLC. And Duxbury Town Meeting was about to vote on whether or not to fully adopt the guidelines. And what happened?
Well, right before the meeting, the EOHLC came in and said, your plan's no good. Okay? So that's one thing. But the other thing is everybody was mad. They did not want this zoning. And there were all these people in this neighborhood who it was going to really strongly affect, because they were putting the housing in a place where the water table is really high. So if you put a whole bunch of housing in there, it would cause floods everywhere.
Yeah.
And they had already had some problems where another piece of dense housing had gone in over there a couple decades ago, and it had blown out some people's and what are they called? Not cesspools.
Leach fields.
Yeah, it had blown them. It had caused problems in the basements and everything.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, and so they wanted that. People just didn't want it. Plus, we, as I have told you before, Duxbury is very strongly supportive of the environment and keeping Duxbury rural. So they just didn't want this housing.
Well, you've got an enormous amount of shoreline. You've got aquaculture business there. You've got oyster farms. And generally, the soil conditions in this part of the state are not all uniform. I mean, you can have clay lenses, you can have bedrock outcrops, you can have all kinds of specific factors that really need to be considered. And it goes to the point about the MBTA Communities Act in general, is that it's a one-size-fits-all piece of legislation. And they just want to impose it on everybody at the same time. And they can also tweak it with time. You notice that since the EOHLC has power to change the guidelines and modify them, who's to say that once we adopt guidelines like this, they don't then come and say, oh, well, here's an update.
I don't think they're going to be able to do that again, given what happened with the SJC. Before the SJC ruling, there were all these rumors going around that they kept editing the guidelines. And but now it seems fairly clear that if they're going to change even a word of the guidelines, they have to put in we should really call them regulations. Right. If they're going to change a word, they have to go through a regulatory process.
Well, I know originally that the MBTA zone that a town picked or designated had to be a contiguous area. But now we're seeing towns, I think they did it in Salem and maybe in one other town, where they're allowing them to designate, Bill Ricker, I think, multiple areas throughout the town to put high-density housing. And then in Norwell's case, and in Marshfield's case, well, Norwell adopted it, unfortunately. They were saying, well, we're going to put it someplace where nothing will ever happen. Well, I'm worried the UHLC is going to show up one day and say, what you did was in bad faith, not compliant with the intent of the law. So therefore, we want you to, modify your zone. That's what I'm worried about. Can you trust the state?
Well, I don't know. I mean, they don't have absolute power, do they?
Well, this seems to be a grab at absolute power, actually. It seems to be a sign that that's what they're after. So that one article you wrote, Compliance for the Sake of Compliance, touched on a lot of those issues. And you also did a summary article on the complaint that was filed itself.
Oh, yeah, on Diana's complaint. But yeah, I think the interesting information, she went over that. She did a really good job on that. I think the interesting information on that article was the number of bills that are in the legislature to repeal all or portions of the MBTA Communities Law. Ken Sweezy has 3 separate bills, and Senator Patrick O'Connor had 2. I thought the second bill that Senator O'Connor had, I thought was particularly clever because it talked about things like the inability to meet drinking water supply requirements, wastewater treatment, municipal transportation infrastructure, environmental impacts, and historical properties. So you start to go after that. It's not like just saying we don't want it. It's like, well, we don't have enough water. What do you want us to do now?
Yeah.
So I thought that was about a sophisticated approach to.
And some of those arguments actually have come back, resurfaced from the arguments we had against 40Bs and continue to have against 40Bs. And there have been a lot of court battles on 40Bs. And I think there were even a couple of cases where the town was mandated to then run a water main up to where a 40B project was being proposed. So in a way, I see the MBTA Communities Act as basically being like 40B on steroids, because there is no permitting agency designated. 40B zones require building and permitting by right, whereas at least the 40B still has to go through a local permitting agency, which in all cases, or almost 99% of cases, is the ZBA. Do you have any hope that there's enough opposition in terms of Duxbury government to fight the good fight on this?
Well, it appeared to me that, as I think we were talking about earlier, they sent in the town attorney from KP Law to the select board on Monday to say that we absolutely have to obey the law and comply by July. But that seemed like a setup, and there was some pushback, especially from one of the select board representatives, Amy McNabb, who did note that the town did not want this, did not want to comply. And so I think what these towns need is a strategy for not complying. Like, if you're not going to comply,
right,
if you don't vote against it, then what's the strategy going forward to contest it? And there has to be, there's so many remaining flaws in the law. For example, why are Duxbury and Marshfield considered MBTA communities for this
right
now? That's something that we should be able to challenge. Now, I don't know how to challenge it, but that's something we should be able to challenge. And then the other thing is, if we stall, we may be able to get more Healy out of government, which is my deepest desire in life, for her to leave the governorship.
Yeah,
And,
that's right. I mean, obviously, I mean, there are legal battles you can fight, and then there are political battles, and that comes down to elections. And
Yeah.
as we saw in the Shrewsbury vote last night, unfortunately, they could not muster the quorum or the number or percentage of voters to show up to shoot down the MBTA zoning that's in Shrewsbury right now.
That was too bad, but did you see what happened in Tewksbury?
I heard in Tewksbury the select board recommended against complying.
They did, and they were so mad. It was so, if you watch the meeting, it's so funny. They were just, the town doesn't want it. We're not going to comply.
Wow. In your article, you mentioned, as far as looking for places to build, you mentioned building sites for this in Duxbury, and I want to just touch upon this before we have to go. What is Island Creek? There was something about an Island Creek property?
Oh, if you're over at the Kingsbury Plaza,
Okay.
there is just on the edge of Duxbury where there used to be an old sand pit. There's a already developed high density housing development over there that we were just going to do a housing zoning overlay on.
I see.
And I'm not sure how many acres they're going to count it as, but there's some neighboring properties that you could maybe fold into that to create a full 25 acres. Because for Duxbury, we're supposed to have 25 contiguous acres. And then the idea is that most people want to do is just find little bits of land here and there to do overlays on.
And I heard during a discussion about the override last night at a meeting with the Duxbury officials that the town has got a very large percentage of land that's under conservation and preservation.
Yes, and we want to keep it that way.
Exactly. I know, because some people are saying, well, why don't we sell off a couple of lots here and there? You know?
That's a bad idea.
Yeah. Christine, I got to leave it there with you, but
Okay.
And that looks like an excerpt or the front page of one of Christine's articles. Again, it's Duxbury.substack for if you want to tune in and find out the latest from Christine Hill. She's done a great job, and it's really heartening, encouraging that we've got people doing things that are speaking out. This is great. I've said this many times before here. We had the Marshfield Reporter, we had the Marshfield Mariner. Okay, they're basically gone. WATD, but they are making some good efforts, to get information out there. But the only place really where you have to go, and what's made the biggest difference over these decades is the growth of social media, in particular Facebook. I've said many times, when you were involved in a fight here in Marshfield, we'd have to print out on the Xerox machine, on a copy machine, flyers, and then would send out groups of people to go door to door, take the flyers, and you have to roll them up and put them in the handle on a storm door or something like that. And now we can reach, and at those times you could reach 400 or 500 people, right? 400 or 500 households. Now with a single post on a local Facebook page, you can reach like 5,000 people. And that's made all the difference in the world. It was interesting to hear Christine mention, talk about the situation in Duxbury. They've got a pro-taxpayer, it seems like, select board member who's up for re-election this spring, so they're in good shape there. It is also interesting to mention that in Shrewsbury, they have a representative town meeting, and that town meeting voted to adopt the MBTA zoning guidelines. Shame on them. They're Marshfield, again, anybody who voted it down is continuing to stave it off and fight it. You did the right thing. Remember how they told us at Marshfield town meeting? This vote is about doing what's correct, the best legal strategy, all that kind of thing. Wow, we dodged a bullet there. I mean, we more than dodged a bullet, okay? We deflected it and pointed it back at them, figuratively speaking. But Shrewsbury has a representative town meeting, and that representative town meeting voted to adopt the guidelines. So they had the voters in Shrewsbury, a bunch of them got together and went through a referendum process to challenge the vote of the representative town meeting. They got the signatures, they got a vote scheduled, which happened yesterday. But guess what? Although 61% of the people that voted to not adopt the MBTA zoning regulations, there is a crucial part about the referendum law that says you must have 20% of the total number of registered voters reject or overturn a vote of the representative town meeting. So because 20% of Shrewsbury's registered voters did not go to the polls and vote no, guess what? The decision of the representative town meeting stands, and Shrewsbury is still stuck with the MBTA zoning guidelines. What a shame, what a shame. And it goes to the point. You've got to get involved. You've got to get the bodies out there. You've got to have people to run for office. And if you don't wake up, I mean, it only takes a matter of minutes, plus your transportation time to get to the polls and vote. You know? And again, this 3A MBTA zoning battle is not going to be done if this complaint filed by Diana Viens is successful. That's not the end of the story. We've got to do something to get rid of 3A completely. And she was right to mention the fact that Representative Ken Sweezy, who represents Precinct 4 and a portion of Precinct 2 here in Marshfield, has filed multiple bills to either amend or repeal the MBTA Zoning Act, and Patrick O'Connor, our state senator, has also filed legislation to address the 3A problem. But again, you have to be involved. I can't say it enough. I've been saying it here for years and years and years. I've run myself unsuccessfully many times. I've only run successfully one time, all right? And look at what I have to deal with. I'm one person on a 5-member board, and we'll talk more. I'll give you more of an update on the housing authority situation next time I see you guys, probably next week. But again, the elections are coming up. You can pull out papers now to run for anything you want. I mean, there's many different offices where there are elections this spring here in Marshfield. And also there's many, many more boards and committees that you can get yourself on by just submitting a letter, to the Board of Selectmen and say, hey, I want to be on Conservation Commission, Zoning Board, Cultural Committee, anything. Consider it. But it's been a problem all along because, as we know here in Marshfield, even trying to get on into an appointed position, you are going to be vetted and investigated, okay? As Bob Parkes used to say, when it comes to the select board, candidates for the select board are selected, elected, then directed, all right? And other people in the great history of this show, check this out. Oh, did we run out? Oh, not even 5 seconds for George.